Okay, so good afternoon, class. So welcome to our virtual class today in BAM 6202, okay, the Philippine tax system and income taxation. So today we are going to discuss the week 2 topic in your LMS, which is the principles of taxation. We are going to discuss the first part of the week 2, and we are going to discuss the second part next meeting, because this is a long topic that we need to stagger, because there are some informations that we need to tackle specifically. So for us, so for you, the students, also for us, also for you to understand all those principles of taxation. So our learning objectives here is to distinguish the police power, the eminent domain power, and the taxation power. To discuss the nature, the scope, and the principles of taxation, and to identify the classification of the taxes. Okay, so our country, or every country, has the following sovereign state. The sovereign state, it's a government or a country which is administer, ruling, and govern the community by the government. Because for every country, we have the government that they use to administer people for the security and for the good welfare. The sovereign state has the following inherent powers which they exercise in order to give orders to the society, or shall we say the government will give orders to the society or the community to command, to maintain the peace and order, to survive our economy or our living, irrespective to our constitutional provision or irrespective to any constitutional provisions. The inherent powers of the sovereign state is composed of three. We have the police power, the eminent domain power, and the taxation power. The first one is the police power. So the police power, this is the inherent power of the sovereign state which they use or to exercise by the government to legislate, okay, for the protection of our welfare, for the protection of the welfare of the society or the community, not only the health, but even the health and the morals of the community. And please take note that the police power is exercised by the government to watch or to guard the community against the excess or abuses of individual liberty. Because all of us, as members of the community, we have our freedom of expression and freedom that is that we do. But please take note that our freedom, our liberty has its limitations, especially if those liberty or freedom can damage other people. That's why the government exercise this to watch us, to guard us for those people who do crimes or abuse of using their freedom to hurt someone or to hurt other people. The next is the eminent domain power. The eminent domain power, this is the power that exercised by the government to take the private property of public purpose. The government may not take over the private property for their personal purpose. These powers are exercised by the government to intervene on the private properties of an individuals, to take over in case that these properties are not yet claimed by the beneficiaries once the owner of the property already died. It's the first one. The second one if those properties are used for public purpose, for the benefit or for the public interest, like example, if some private properties are used for the infrastructures that will benefit the public interest, then there will be a just compensation. A just compensation in a sense that the government may buy the properties to the private sectors or the private individuals to use for the public purpose. And the private people, the private individuals or sectors have nothing to do but to comply. The government will not force, or they will not use their forces to enforce, to exercise this power to the private individuals, because there should be a win-win solution that the private individuals permitted the government to buy their properties for public purpose. That's why they this power may only use to take the private property into public purpose. And if the private individual is still alive, then the government will negotiate it and pay for the price or for the compensation of this property that can be used for the public interest. The third one is the taxation power. This part of the government is the most divine power of the government, because taxation power, it is an inherent power of the sovereign state to enforce contribution upon the person, which is us, the individuals, regardless if it is a natural or juridical persons, properties owned by a natural and juridical person, and even the rights. Okay? This power may be exercised to enforce contribution from the persons, properties, and the rights to generate funds or to generate the revenues to function the power and authority of the government, and to use this revenue for the government function or expenses, because taxes is the revenue of the government, and taxes is the lifeblood of the government to take over, to govern the people, because it may not exercise the power if there will be no wealth. And of course, as a citizen of the country, we are obliged to pay our taxes to support the government, to rule us, in return, that will guard us, to protect our humanity, to protect the lives of the people, and to protect the welfare of the people who living in a sovereign state. But this taxation power may not be exercised by the government if there's no tax law created to exercise it. Because yes, we have our constitution that exercises the taxation power, but we need a specific law for the tax on how it may exercise by the authorized government agency to collect taxes to those following persons, properties, and rights. So what are the similarities of the three inherent powers of the sovereign state? Of course, they are the inherent powers of the state. That's the similarities. Even though they have different functions, but they constitute three powers of the sovereign state that can be used. The inherent powers are similar because they are legislative in nature and character, because it may not exercise without a law. The inherent powers are also presuppose an equivalent compensation and underlie and exist independently of the Constitution. The similarities of those inherent powers are all necessary attributes for the sovereignty, and even the provisions in the Constitution, these inherent powers have limitations to exercise these powers. Yes, the government has the following limitation to exercise those powers because, in a sense, if the government may overrule or abuse these powers, that's another story that will also can lead to a devastation instead of peace. That's why the government should be careful in exercising the powers to all the people who live in the state. So what are the distinctions between these inherent powers? As to the concept, the taxation has the power to enforce contribution to raise government tax. The police power is to make and implement the laws of the general welfare. And for the eminent domain, the power to take the private property for public use with just compensation. As to the scope, taxation is unlimited, plenary, comprehensive, and supreme one, while the police power is a broader as to the scope in application of the general power and to make and implement laws. Eminent domain has the merely power to take the private property for public use. As to the authority, the distinction of these inherent powers that the taxation and police power are exercised only by the government, both national and local. While the eminent domain, it may be granted to public service or public utility companies, which the government can intervene in case that those public utility companies may not or not capable to take to roll over to their customers. As an example of the Maynilad, the Meralco, as an example, in case that they are incapable to control the prices or they may abuse an overprices that will hard for the customers, then the government can intervene and can take over their management to rule for the public interest. If that will happen. But what I'm trying to say is the government can be granted by that in case. That's why those public utility companies are also, they need to comply with the regulations or the government policies in managing those things. To the purpose, what's the distinction? Taxation power is the money taken to support the government, while the police power is the money or properties taken or destroyed to promote the general welfare. For the eminent domain, that the private property is taken for the public use. The distinction of these inherent powers as to the necessity of delegation, the taxation power has the power to make tax laws or created tax regulations that cannot be delegated. While the police power and eminent domain, it can be expressly delegated to the local government unit. As to the persons affected, taxation operates on a community or a class of individuals, while the police power operates on a community or a class of individuals. And the eminent domain, also the same, or shall we say it might be distinctive to the taxation and police power that operates on the particular private property of an individual. As to the benefits, taxation power is continuous protection and organized society. The police power, the benefit is to the maintenance of healthy economic standards of society. while the eminent domain, the market value of the property expropriated. As to the importance, taxation power is inseparable for the existence of a nation. It supports police power and eminent domain. While the police power, it gives protection, safety, and welfare to society, and the eminent domain, the common necessities and interests of the community transcends individual rights in property. As to the amount of imposition, taxation power has no limit, but the police power, that the limitation is sufficient to cover the cost of the license and the necessary expenses of police surveillance and regulation. And for the eminent domain, there will be no imposition. The owner is paid at the fair market value of his property. As to the limitation, the distinctions, that the taxation power, that the constraints by constitutional and inherent limitations. The police power is limited by the demand for the public interest, and the eminent domain is bounded by the public purpose and just compensation. And as the relationship to the Constitution, the taxation is subject to constitutional and inherent limitations because taxation power cannot be exercised in full without legislative creations or without levying. The police power, as to the relationship to Constitution, it is relatively free from the constitutional limitations, while the eminent domain, it is superior to and may override constitutional limitations. So those are the distinctions of the inherent powers of the sovereign state. Okay, so let us proceed now to the highlight of the topic, which is the nature of the taxation power. As I had said, that this power of the government, the inherent powers of the sovereign state, this is the most divine because it will not exercise the police power and eminent domain if there are no wealth or no revenue. If the government has no revenue or no wealth to exercise their power and functions. That's why this is the taxation power is the attribute of sovereignty of the government to collect taxes or to enforce contribution to the persons, properties, and the rights of which the sovereign state has to cover in order to generate revenues for the government funds that can be used for their function to protect the humanity, to protect the welfare, to create economic activities that will improve the living of the sovereign state. That's why the taxation power, it may support the government for their utilitarian activities, and also the government will give incentives to those people who used to pay their taxes. Because the revenues of the government through our taxes, it may use it for the public interest that all people can benefit, not only some, but all people. So what is the basis of taxation? The basis of taxation, of course, we have the principle of necessity. As I said, no government can exist without taxation because tax is the lifeblood of the government that represents the wealth and the revenue to exercise the other powers and functions. And reciprocal duties that both of the government and the taxpayers has the obligation to do. Once the people pay their taxes, then the government's obligation is to utilize it properly. Okay, so what's the purpose of taxation? The principal purpose of taxation is to raise revenues and to support government for their functions and activities. that will benefit the public interest. The secondary purpose is to serve the people to protect the welfare of the sovereign state and even the community. Because as I've said, if there will be no funds, if there will be no revenue, how the government may exercise their powers to protect us. So what are the scope of taxation? The scope of the taxation is unlimited. It is a complete or plenary. It is a comprehensive because there is a wide extent of application. That's why we have our National Internal Revenue Code as part of the tax law. As I said earlier, it is a supreme because this is the highest degree of the power. And please take note, the taxation power is subject to constitutional and inherent limitations. So please take note that what are the constitutional limitations of the taxation power? Because please take note that if there are some laws that contradicts the Constitution, this tax law may not enforce legally. If there are some tax laws created by the Congress or the legislative body that will violate the Constitution. So what are those constitutional limitations? Of course, that the tax law has a due process. And make sure that the law can be created with equal protection. And please take note that there will be no imprisonment for those people who doesn't pay the community tax on a regular basis. Please take note also that part of the constitutional limitation that the rule of taxation shall be uniform and equitable. And please take note that there will be an exemption to the property taxation of religious, charitable, and educational institutions, and even the non-profit cemeteries, churches, convents appurtenant thereto. And there will be no public money or property shall be used for any religious or private purposes by the government. The majority of all members of the National Congress can pass or shall pass the granting of tax exemptions. The Congress also may not deprive the Supreme Court for the jurisdiction to give a decision on the tax cases. The President has the power to veto or to contradict any item of the law or the tax bill approved by the Congress in case it will not good for the public. And the tax collection shall be treated as a general funds of the government. And what are those inherent limitations? The inherent limitations, these are the natural restrictions to safeguard that the power of taxation shall be exercised by the government only for the betterment of the people whose interests should be served, enhanced, and protected. Meaning, inherent limitations according to the Constitution, there is no legal inherent limitations, but the taxation power has its kind of inherent limitations, so the government may not abuse the taxation power. So what are those inherent limitations? Please take note that the taxes may only exercise based on the creation of law or public purpose. The power of taxation shall not be delegated except to local government. The tax laws are only confined within the territorial jurisdiction of the state, meaning that the tax laws are only applied upon the territorial coverage of our state, that it cannot be applied to other countries. Tax laws must be subject to international committee, convention, and agreements. That's why we have the following reciprocities. Government entities, the government sectors are exempted from the tax and provision of double taxation. Of course, there is no provision of double taxation, but in case that the taxpayers may claim the double taxation, then the government may give it in return or shall return the double taxation. So that will be the first part of our topic for today when it comes to the week 2 topic in your LMS, which is the principles of taxation. So we are going to discuss the second part, next meeting.